Telefilm Canada, working with writers, helping get scripts ready to be produced. Jamie has worked in the private sector in Montreal for Gallup Films. She is bilingual. Way back when we worked together both at the International Center of Films for Youth and Children and Young People, thank you. I think of it in French. And also at the magazine. Jamie has won prizes for her writing, both for the CBC and was nominated for the Critics Award in Quebec. And you have to know that for an Anglophone to be nominated for the Critics Award in Quebec is quite a deal. So I present Jamie Gaetz.
You can come in, yeah, take a seat here.
Aren't you going to come with me? Oh dear. So I prepared something, and I think I'm going to toss a lot of it out and try to respond to some of the comments that you made here. And from there, maybe get into a discussion of what this meant to English Canadian cinema, what it still means, and also comment that I now know who the rebels are in this room.
Rebels.
Yeah, because when we talk about Westerns, and let's just start from the concept of genre, this is not a typical Western. He's not a hero. He doesn't come in and save people. In fact, based on the true story, he is a bandit, he's gentlemanly, but 48 years of his life were spent stealing, and 33 of those years were spent in prison. So how do you make a movie where someone is heroic with that kind of truth behind the hero? He's an anti-hero, and yet we fall in love with him. Some of us do, some of us don't. We're a bit more conventional. But so if we look at it in terms of a Canadian Western, this is the way that Canada would make a Western film. It's not a lot of death and destruction. It's about a polite man who robs from the banks, who robs from the rich people. He's a Robin Hood on a horse, you know, with a gun. If we talk about the symbolism of the train, the metaphor of the train, yes, it's a passage, but Philip Borsos, the director, commented on the theme of the film and suggested that he, as most artists do, they always work on the same story, the same concept. And he said, it's what I always work on, what I always want to make films about. It's about a guy dragged kicking and screaming into the new century. So the story of Bill Miner, he was released after 25 years in prison. He had done a total of 33, off and on, but the last stint was 25 years in San Quentin, 1901. Stagecoaches don't exist anymore. His way of living, making a living, he robbed stagecoaches, didn't exist anymore. It was now trains. So the train is a symbol of the technology of the new century, and he has to conquer that. And he tries. Sadly, he doesn't really succeed very well. And I think that's an important element of the film, and it's an important element the way that Borsos uses it, as it snakes through, as it speeds around corners. There's one scene in particular where it's a huge, hulking, shiny beast coming almost straight at us at an angle, and in that he is denoting what Bill Miner was up against. So that's about the Western. And the symbolism, but the Western is very interesting, and I think most of you have seen a lot of Westerns and American Westerns, and you commented on the black and white scenes. I'm pretty sure, and I don't know this exactly, that he used historic footage and footage from other films, and that's why there's black and white and there's different color, because there's no way that they could have afforded to to do those scenes. Plus, the opening shot, I don't know if you remember, but it's a stagecoach going through the West, and there are the big, what we called out West, the hoodoos, big rock formations. So there's a vastness, right? And there's just the stagecoach going. They wouldn't have been able to shoot that around where they shot this film. This film was actually produced, shot on locations around where Bill Miner holed up. So there's some truth in that. Phil Borsos' background was documentary, and one of the criticisms was that this didn't stray far enough into fiction. He didn't do a good job of fictionalizing Bill Miner's life. In fact, the romance is fictional. His escape is fictional. The truth is that he escaped. He had a couple more unsuccessful robberies and escaped from prison and hid out in a swamp and ingested swamp water, and then was captured again and died a rather painful death in prison. What the final scene is suggesting, when they're walking the three robbers out to the train, and the band is playing and people are waving flags, and the little boy gives him an orange. What the reference is to in Bill Miner's real life was that he was beloved where he went, and where he was finally captured. The people tried to, they paid for certain things for him, and when he died, they actually paid for his funeral. Why? He's a robber, he's a bandit, yes, a gentlemanly bandit, but a beloved bandit. And this raises a lot of questions. In terms of the American and the Canadian as well, he's an American. Our great Canadian Western is about an American who committed the first train robbery in Canada. And we are eulogizing this man in this film. We are mythologizing his character and his life of crime. It's a contradictory proposition. It contradicts good sense in that we don't make heroes out of robbers, out of thieves, and yet this film does. And there's a lot of background. Casting Richard Farnsworth is what I call a lucky accident. He was not originally cast, and I don't know how you feel about him, but you mentioned, his face, his eyes, the smile. He just, even underneath that big bushy mustache, he smiles, and you feel this warmth emanating from him. In fact, the film was originally cast with Harry Dean Stanton, and maybe you know him as well. He was weaselly. He's a skinny little dark-haired guy who's not very attractive. He always plays the creepy guy. So imagine this film. Imagine that with him playing Bill Miner. It would be completely different. The feeling that we get from it, the response that we have to it, those of us who didn't respond too negatively, who were charmed by it, it would be very, very different. And I think that if they had succeeded in getting him, and in fact the film apparently was financed on the basis of him playing in the role, it would have been very different, and I'm not sure that it would be it would have been as welcomed. It would have been maintained or attained the kind of reputation that it has. Some other comments. The feminism. She's a fictional character, who who was introduced by the writer and the director. There was a female photographer named Mary Spencer living in Kamloops. She did take pictures of Bill Miner, and they are historic pictures. The romance between them, doubtful, but hey, there's a female photographer in the place where he's holed up. Why not bring them together and make a romance in something that has no romance? There's no female characters. Westerns, you have to have a female character. It's the woman back home with the gingham tablecloth, and she's always the coffee pot on the stove. That's the traditional American Western, not traditional Western. It's a Canadian Western. And I think that's how, if you see our films about historic events, we will always do it non-traditionally, with questions, with doubts, and that, whether we like it or not, to my mind, is part of our Canadian identity, is that we will go for not the underdogs, because that's the American. We'll go for the counterculture. We'll go for the less obvious. And we have not made films about our heroes. That's one of the great losses, great flaws in our Canadian film canon. We have not exploited the heroes. And we do have heroes. Most Canadians don't know their names. And so as immigrants coming, how can you find out who we admire and respect if we don't know them ourselves? So other things about the film, beyond that, I have to remind myself, I told Connie I'm going to get up there and I'm going to blank, was the sense of space. You notice that there's not a lot of people. I think that was a choice on the part of the director and the production team. The film was made for somewhere between $3 and $4 million. 1980 seems like it should have been a lot of money, but the production ran into trouble, and the producer apparently had to sell his house in order to be able to complete it. So you look at it, and a lot of the shots, a lot of the scenes involve 2 people, maybe 3 people. You don't see any big production. You don't see any big shootouts. 2 major scenes. One, the horses running with the train. I honestly don't know how they did that. That would have been exorbitant, just in terms of wrangling the horses, the train, which was an old steam engine. It wasn't even, would have had to have been brought out of a museum and made to run, and get the horses running, and have it not turn terribly wrong, where, the horses are killed, which would have been, it's just, I don't know how he did it. And then the other big scene is at the end, with people at the train station. Other than that, there are no scenes where there are more than 2 or 3 or 4 people. Very easy to manage for a first-time feature director. Simple to set up, much simpler to set up in terms of shooting, in terms of paying. So, just in that, you've got a Canadian Western. It was done with not a lot of money, although in retrospect, I've just come off working for the government for 8 years. Telefilm Canada now won't finance anything that's $3 or $4 million. They can't. The last few years, I worked on films that were all done for under $2 million, and generally for 1.2 and under. Certainly, technology allows that now because of the cameras, because of the editing. You can use smaller crews. You don't have to develop film, all of that. But at the same time, I'm going to mention that Canada is making very small budget films, which don't get shown anywhere, and huge budget films. So when I was looking at this again, I was thinking about Barney's version, and I don't know if any of you saw that. It was a based on the book by Mordecai Richler, who also wrote The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz. It was like this one and like the Capital Cost Allowance films. It starred international stars, American, Paul Giamatti, Richard Dreyfuss, Minnie Driver, Rosamund Pike. It was made for between $20 and $30 million. I'm not quite sure. It's conflictual. Canadian box office was somewhere between 7 and 8 million, and it was touted as a big success. But how can it be a big success if it was made for $25 million, and even around the world it only made 15 million? It didn't make back its money. This one, The Grey Fox, was made for between 3 and 4 million and made over $5 million at the box office in North America. So you asked about how Canadians responded to it. It's actually a beloved film. It's when I mentioned to friends that I was going to be speaking about it, across the board, all my friends, oh, Richard Farnsworth, Jackie Burroughs, I'd love to see that film again. I wonder where I could see that film again. So if you think, if it made, $5.5 million in 1982, tickets were what, about $6? As opposed to 12 now. So to make $5 million then, double the amount of people were going to see it as would be going to see it now. So in terms of its correspondence with Quebec, I'm going to just say Two Solitudes. I don't even know if it showed in Quebec. It did show in English Canada. And it obviously showed quite widely, played quite widely, because people across Canada know it and remember it. It was broadcast on TV for a few years following that. Now it's not available anymore. It's one of the great tragedies because, and I have this quote here, it's been named by the Canadian Audiovisual Trust, which is a historical, a society, a non-profit organization established to protect and save our audiovisual cultural documents, so films, video recordings, music, and so on. So this has been named, this film has been named, and I'm sorry I'm going to forget the actual wording of it. Oh, I'm not going to be able to find it. It's been named as a masterwork by the AV Trust, and yet it's not available on DVD. Connie mentioned how difficult it was to get it on VHS cassette from the States. I got in touch with Peter O'Brien, the producer, who was willing to loan his copy, but he needed it back because there are no other copies. So this is something considered a masterwork to Canadian culture, and it's not available. I think this is a tragedy. I'm going to be outspoken here. The AV Trust, from what if I recall correctly, had its funding cut, and it shut its doors. So now we don't even have an organization taking care of our cultural products. And yet we continue to invest. As Canadians, your tax dollars going into this stuff. You're not going to get to see it anywhere, nor is anybody in the future going to get to see it. And that's just my little rant about the government. So the film, we talk about, I don't want to talk about the budget and distribution and all of that kind of thing. The film and the images. This, I commented that it's really dark. The images are very dark, and I don't remember it being that way. And I feel sad that we had to see it like this because there was much more texture to it. Certainly it was, the images were dark, but they weren't black. Black where you only have a little speck of light and you can't see the faces, the contours. For example, in the bar scene, When the guy comes at him with the knife, you can't even see the contours of his face on the dark side. And I honestly don't remember it being that way. I don't think it was, because that's not good movie making. So I think part of your response to it might have been that it's difficult to penetrate something and find the meaning in it when it's just black. There's no light in it. You need to have light cast on for your eyes to gravitate towards something, and that's how the director gives you meaning, provides you an understanding of what the meaning is. And something else about, I'm forgetting comments over there.
Libido comment?
Yeah.
Is that activist comment?
The activist and the
The
libido.
and the libido. I don't think Amir, I don't think she demonstrated a wild libido. She was a middle-aged woman who had never had a lover, had never probably even kissed a man, and she met somebody who appreciated her. You notice that the publisher of the newspaper, made very derogatory comments about her. Oh, there's nothing wrong with her that a good husband wouldn't fix. That's very derogatory, because it's stating that she has no value beyond taking care of a man. And what she was doing with her life was saying, I have value as an independent woman, as an independent human being, whether I'm man or woman. I have value. So I don't think that she had, she demonstrated, wild libido. She fell in love, had one lover, and obviously they made plans, they referenced plans, so obviously they were going to get married. And so that's very romantic. I mean, this is an incredible romanticization of a rather bleak life, ultimately. He didn't escape, they didn't make it to Europe, they didn't, this is fiction. So that's what I'm going to say to you, Amir. So the film, now I was talking about the emptiness and the vast spaces, which you get, and there's a shot of her when she's golfing up on the hill, and the mountains are in behind. That part of British Columbia is that beautiful. It's extraordinarily beautiful, and it is still wild. You don't see many people. You notice that when they come out, the three of them, Bill Miner, Kate, and Corporal Fernie, come out to investigate the Chinese, and they are a Chinese family. It's the Chinese man who murders his family and then runs away and commits suicide. You get a sense that there's a town, it's Christmas morning, and the way that they conveyed the sense of a populated town was on the soundtrack. People in church singing a hymn. And so that was so cheap. You put on music, and what you're indicating is that everybody is off at church singing, and the town is populated. But we're only seeing 3 people. So they got around they did a lot of interesting things. I'm still mystified why it cost $3 to $4 million and they still couldn't make the film. But it was different back then. It was very, very different. It was much more expensive because of the film. You had to courier it off and, all of that. I'm going to talk about the script a little bit because that's what I know. And I don't know if you're interested, but in terms of storytelling, the images are one level. It's the words on the page that provide the impetus for the images on the screen. And this script won the best screenplay from the Genies, which you've probably been mentioned before. It's the Canadian version of the Oscars. In fact, this film won a total of 7 Genies in the year that it was released. It was very interesting looking at what the competition was. Quest for Fire, remember Quest for Fire, was essentially a French film. which came to Canada and got some money, and so got Canadian status. It was directed by Jean-Jacques Arnaud, who you may know as well from the French. He went on to direct the likes of Brad Pitt and so on. So major French director. It was a large budget project, much larger than this one. And so that screenplay, written by somebody. So, and another one was a film written that was pure capital cost allowance. It was an American writer, an American director, an American cast. They shot a little bit in Canada and got a bunch of money, and so the script got nominated for the best award. One was Une journée en taxi. Do you remember that film? It was also up for the best screenplay award. This up against this, and another one called Latitude 55 Degrees, which was written by a Canadian screenwriter who I have high respect for, named Sharon Reese. She wrote something called Loyalties, and several other things. Very good writer. But this one won the best screenplay. Is it a fabulous screenplay? No. If we look at what it is and what you look for in a good story, this is a good story. It's about the first Canadian train robbery in Canada. That's the impetus for, hey, first, it's historical, it's a gentleman bandit, the guy who they claim is actually the first guy who said hands up, although he doesn't in the film. So you've got the basis for a good story. Is it well told? The writer sets it up. We look for 3 acts. The beginning, the middle, and the end. Those are your 3 acts. The first act is pretty good here. He sets everything up. It's tight. It moves. He gets out of prison. He gets on a train. He discovers the technology, the apple peeler. He goes and works in the oyster beds, and he can't settle down. He's a man on the move. He states, I can't work for somebody else. I've got my own ideas. I have to be able to live my own ideas. Something we're all going to respect, I think. Most of us will. He robs a train, he escapes into Canada. That's your first act. Well, actually what we call the inciting incident. That's your very first important moment when the character makes a decision, discovers some knowledge, some information, and makes a decision and changes the course of his or her life, and that creates the arc of the movie, what we call the character arc. That moment in this film, and we all know it, is when he sits in the movie theater and watches the great train robbery, and all of a sudden his life has new meaning, because he doesn't have to rob stagecoaches, he can rob trains. And from then on, he's on his path. He's made his first decision, the first turning point. And his fate will be set by that decision. And that's what we look for in a good script. So up to that moment, the script works really well. It's wonderful. It engages us. You didn't get engaged by him, because who's going to engage with a guy who makes his living by robbing trains? And, then he gets into Canada and he meets Jack Budd, and we get all flabby, what I call flabby. And I think that Don Shabib mentioned something about the lack of conflict in Canadian films. We just don't understand conflict. Conflict arises when you've got a source of antagonism. You've got a lead character who has set a goal, and there are forces pushing against him or her achieving that goal. There's nothing pushing against him. The law enforcement is off somewhere in the background. They're in the United States of America. Bill Miner makes friends with the local corporal. He's friends with the police. So where is the conflict? Where is the tension? He's just falling in love, and there's all these idyllic and lyric scenes, and oh my God, it goes on and on and on. As charming as they are, we've lost the source of conflict. We've lost the tension. There's nothing happening. And that's where we lose the film. When it was beautiful, when it was beautiful on the big screen, the landscape filled that void to some extent, and that can be a terrific means of filling in a second act. Put the character outside into nature, and but this actually doesn't get going again until the failed horse rustling, and then you feel like something is going to start happening, and then the Pinkerton's detective shows up, and all of a sudden now we've got something to pushing him out, and he's got to start running. And what did you think was the most Canadian scene in the film? I'll tell you what I think.
In the court?
In the court.
That's pretty Canadian, but for me, I think it's when the Pinkerton agent, the American, is facing the corporal and telling him what to do, and the corporal is saying, and then the American stands up and says, "We are on the same side, aren't we?" This is what we hate about the Americans. Oh, it's almost like something, like the writer and the director planted that scene to get the Canadians going, yes, yes, right? Yeah. So then we've got that flabby second act, and it's really too bad that something could have been done in terms of a subplot, because the film lacks a subplot, and that's where you can explore those elements. So the subplot would be the police, the Pinkerton, the detectives, all of those forces out hunting for him. So we would get a sense of, oh my God, they're only 5 miles down the road. They're closing in on him. And then we would start worrying about him. He's going to get captured. We want him to get away. He's not fighting against anything. That's why we can't engage with him. Also because he's an anti-hero. He's a train robber, a bandit, a jailbird, essentially, 33 years in prison. Who's going to be friends with somebody who spent 33 years in prison? So those are some of the flaws. Then we get into the third act, and the third act wraps things up. It doesn't do it effectively. It does it with the intertitles, telling us that he was never seen in Canada again, and that the photographer, was seen in Europe with a wealthy mining engineer named George Anderson. So that tells us that he got away and they lived happily ever after. But I'm telling you, that's not the truth. That isn't the way the story ended. How the film was received was interesting. It was generally very well received by critics. I came across one negative comment, and that was from a critic from Toronto, which it's notorious. The Toronto film critics never like films that are made outside of Toronto. They will never give a good review to a film made in the West or in the East. And I'm going to contradict what Connie said about a strong film industry being in the regions. In fact, there are very good filmmakers who live in St. John's, Newfoundland, in Halifax, Nova Scotia, in Edmonton, Alberta, and Vancouver, BC. And I think that it's not logical that we can have money spent in all parts of Canada, but I think given the vastness of this country, I think it's sad to ask people to leave their homes in order to be able to practice their art. And that's what filmmakers are required to do. And because of what's happening with the government financing right now, that's exactly what's happening, is that there's an exodus from Vancouver and from the East Coast to Toronto because they can't make their art where they live. And I think that that's something that's a loss, really, because what happens is everybody becomes a Torontonian, and you end up with films only having a Toronto voice, what we call a voice in cinema. This one, someone from Toronto would not have made that film because they wouldn't have had the concept of the vastness of the landscapes. So I think that that's a tragedy. So I'm just going to quote a couple of the...
It's 5 minutes.
Good,
To wrap it up.
because I want to wrap it up. Roger Ebert, for me, had the best quote. He called it charming. And it's charming because of the way that Richard Farnsworth plays the role. It's Richard Farnsworth, to me, encapsulates the idea of a gentleman bandit. He calls everyone son, sir, please, after you. So Canadian, and yet he was American. So that, and Vincent Canby in a New York critic. Those are two of the great American film critics. Loved it as well. He called it a gentle, intelligent, very leisurely paced Western with one terrific asset, Richard Farnsworth. Richard Farnsworth, you want to see him again if you're at all interested. David Lynch made a movie called The Straight Story, and Richard Farnsworth is the lead character, and he makes a journey across America, across the Midwestern states on a tractor. That's modern, 1999, I think so, and he was nominated for an Academy Award. Richard Farnsworth also won an Academy Award for a minor role in a minor film called Comes the Horseman, but he was a stuntman.